The way in which we believe that America was organically founded and what our founding virtues and principles are not actually true. I want to just talk about that for a second, and I'm using two references to really underscore this idea. One is this book, American Nations, by Colin Woodard, in which the author does an amazing job of talking about how different aspects of America, you can kind of see the map there, how it was founded, and literally how in America we have these different regions that exist culturally, but they're not defined by maps, right? So the shape of our states don't necessarily in any way correlate to the culture of those regions. And what's really interesting is a lot of the way that our country to this day, I believe, has evolved is based on the culture and work ethic that comes out of New York City, because New York City is so wealthy and it has been prominently used in many, many stories. The one that comes to mind right away would be The Great Gatsby. Okay, but what was it actually like? I mean, the people who founded this country, who came here, at least those in New England, those that are in alignment with what we usually think of as the American myth and how our country was founded. Um, and so one of those American people that I look towards is John Adams. And the reason I look towards John Adams is because I believe that he is a really wonderful representative of what the actual feelings in the country were at that time. And also, he's an incredibly virtuous person, an incredibly stubborn person who won't defect from his principles. And I am so in awe and applause of that, as those are attributes that I look to magnify within myself. And so I just want to read this little short part here. And this is John with his two sons in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And John is there trying to get the Dutch to lend money to the Americans so they can fight the revolution. So the winter of 1780 to 1781, while John Adams was in Amsterdam on a diplomatic mission, was an extremely harsh winter. This period is part of the Little Ice Age, a time characterized by colder than average temperatures in Europe. So this winter from 1780 to 1781 was particularly severe across the entire continent. Now, Amsterdam, with its numerous canals, experienced extensive freezing during this particular winter. It was common for canals to freeze cold and solid, allowing people to skate on them, a tradition still cherished in the Netherlands. However, these cold temperatures would have impacted daily life significantly, including everything from transportation to the daily routines of its inhabitants. And remember, too, they didn't have any kind of modern heating conveniences, so everything was heated with fire, so it was very smoky. And I don't know for sure what their fuel source was, but I imagine it smelling just sooty and damp, and maybe like peat a little bit, depending on what their fuel source was. So Adams was in the Netherlands for diplomatic work that was crucial for the United States to try and secure a loan. And so the problem that he was having was so many people in the Netherlands hadn't even heard of America. They didn't even know what was going on, and it really shocked him. Can you imagine, like, being over there in Europe and in a country that is wealthy enough to borrow money to America, and people don't even know about America? It must have been an interesting place for him to be psychologically, to be aware of America and his personal family, but all those that he cared about in its cause, and how just the number of people that were relying on him and his success. And yet over here, there are people going about their day-to-day business who have no idea that this is even going on. And so he has to first get them up to speed on what is going on, but he has to do so in a way that also causes them to be sympathetic to their cause. And that was the hardest thing first, is that when John Adams was over there, nobody within the government would even talk with him, because they wouldn't talk with anyone from the United States, because they hadn't formally recognized the United States as real yet, which is really curious. We see that going on today still, but now the United States has that role. The United States is now the kingmaker when it comes to recognizing whether or not another state is a real country or not. And that's essentially what John had to convince the Dutch of. When he was there, he had to convince them that, hey, the United States is a real country. If they didn't recognize America as a real independent country, then there'd be nothing to discuss. But by recognizing America as an independent country, the Dutch were then able to negotiate with us and talk with us. So let me just read this real quick, because what I want to characterize too is, as I mentioned, with the American nations idea, is the themes and cultures that exist here. So America, remember, being founded at different times by different people. Let's go to New York. New York was once called New Amsterdam because it was founded by the Dutch. And I think when I read this passage here, and you'll learn a bit about what the idea of frugality meant to Americans and what frugality means to the Dutch, and you'll be able to see that that Dutch idea of frugality and their worldview on how one should pursue money above all else became the dominant culture within New York City, New Amsterdam, and continues to be so to this day. And that culture and those attitudes have been exported through our media and through many other things as being necessary and normal, and also part of how America was originally set up. And this passage is going to show that it's not. It's going to show that, no, frugality and being wise with your money is a very good virtue and a good thing to pursue, but there is a balance. So, let me begin. A hard North Sea winter set in to match Adams' mood. Days were cold and raw, with darkness descending at 4 in the afternoon, and the air of Amsterdam thick with chimney smoke. With the canals frozen, thousands of skaters took to the ice, a spectacle that provided what little cheer Adams found in life. His health was suffering. He worried about his sons. At the Latin school, because he spoke no Dutch, John Quincy had been placed with elementary students. Okay, so by this time, John Quincy Adams, who was already 13 or 14 at this time, had already learned English and French and was already learning Dutch. He had traveled with his father in France, so he had learned diplomacy and politics and history and literature and geography. He had already crossed the Atlantic Ocean twice. He lived in the United States, France, England, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And so now imagine a 13, 14-year-old, extremely well-educated, very polite, probably more well-educated than most adults at this time, now having to attend an elementary school. Only because there wasn't any other schools he could attend in Amsterdam because he didn't understand Dutch well enough. So he could speak French and English, but he had to attend elementary school because that was his language level with the Dutch at the time. So John Quincy Adams was born July 11, 1787, and would have been 13 or 14 at the time. And Charles Adams was born May 29, 1770, and would have been 10 to 11 during this time. What's also very fascinating is that while all this is going on, John Adams has 2 more kids living in Boston or Braintree, Massachusetts, with his wife Abigail. And a lot of what we know is their correspondences to each other. So continuing. At a Latin school, because he spoke no Dutch, John Quincy Adams had been placed with elementary students. The boy grew restless, and disheartened. The rector of the school thought him impertinent and merited thrashing. As he informed his father, Adams' response was exactly what his own father's would have been. "Send the boys to me this evening," he answered. He had no wish to see his children subjected to such littleness of soul. He explained to Abigail in a letter in which he gave vent not only to his indignation at the schoolmaster, but at what he had come to see as a decidedly unattractive side to the Dutch character, that he had no desire to see rub off on his sons. "The masters are mean-spirited wretches, punching, kicking, and boxing the children upon every turn," Adams wrote. No longer did he see the Dutch as examples of the world, but perceived now bitterly a general littleness arising from the incessant contemplation of stivers and doits, pennies and nickels, which pervades the whole people. Frugality and industry were virtues everywhere, but avarice and stinginess were not frugality. And this right here, I think, is so important to talk about again, is that this attitude of the Dutch, and Adams is already a very he would call himself economical, right? He was very aware of money and resources and wasn't about counting every penny, in this Dutch way, but was just about, being aware of and accountable for and responsible with your money, right? And trying to make it last and finding that balance between economy and practicality and luxury. But what he's noticing here is that the Dutch are very, very different than that. And again, he says, a general littleness arising from the incessant contemplation of stivers and doits, which are the same as penny and nickels. That's all they care about, which pervades the whole people. Frugality and industry were virtues everywhere, but avarice and stinginess were not frugality. And he goes on. The Dutch say that without a habit of thinking of every doit before you spend it, no man can be a good merchant or conduct trade with success. This, I believe, is a just maxim in general, but I would never wish to see a son of mine govern himself by it. It is the sure and certain way for an industrious man to be rich. It is the only possible way for a merchant to become the first merchant, or the richest man in the place. But this is an object that I hope none of my children will ever aim at. I just think that that's so beautiful. And I love that somebody like John Adams saw it back then. And I think it's still true today, that there's obviously such virtue in frugality and industry, but avarice and stinginess are not frugality. And we live in a time in which this Dutch view of the world has been put on steroids and fed to us as something that is true, as though it's like the ultimate truth, and it's not. And I know some people know that and acknowledge that, but especially in America, this idea of like John talks about, he says here, the habit of thinking of every doit before you spend it. No man can be a good merchant or conduct trade with success. This, I believe, is a just maxim in general, but I would never wish to see a son of mine govern himself by it. It is the sure and certain way for an industrious man to be rich. It is the only possible way for a merchant to become the first merchant, or the richest man in the place. But this is an object that I hope none of my children will ever aim at. And you see, what John is getting at here is it's nothing wrong with being rich, or even in these things in being the first or the richest man. But to do so as an aim, as your goal, as your objective, is what he's calling out here. So John's philosophy is one of the best that I've ever studied, and that I wholeheartedly adopt much of it for myself, or I should say maybe I don't even adopt it, but it's revealed to me that those same convictions are programmed and strung within me. John later went on, and this is one of his quotes. He says, I must study politics and war, so that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture, in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. And he saw then that the beauty of our system is to allow our society to thrive and not to stay stuck in this combative competitiveness of this Dutch view of mercantilism, but that was simply a step that kind of allows you to evolve more towards this understanding of life that he experienced in France. And John, I think, had this really great balance between a lot of what the English embodied and what the French embodied. And again, this quote that he needs to study war and politics so that his sons can study mathematics and philosophy, so that their children can study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. And we could add to that music and anything in the arts and anything that is creative today. Essentially, what John is saying is, I'm willing to study more in politics so that my children and my children's children don't have to, so that they can pursue things that are creative in their life, that they can make and create things that are beautiful, that resonate with them and bring beauty to the world, and not things that require such meanness as John was experiencing. And what I find so interesting is that this isn't new. This information has been around for a long time. And who John studied and looked up to were the ancients. And those are people that I look up to and that we can all look up to as well. And it's very interesting as well because many generations have passed since John Adams was here. And there's been multiple opportunities for multiple generations of Americans to create and embody these changes for future generations. And I think it's time to look at this again and really ask ourselves what it is that we want to embody and who we want to be. And we can do that better by understanding where we are currently. We can understand where we are currently by understanding how we got here. Where we're at, why our culture is the way it is, and how this idea that it's always been this way isn't true, and that the idea that our culture has to be this way isn't true. These were different cultures from around the world that when America was founded got put in here. The seed got put in the ground here, seed got put in the ground there, and those seeds have grown, and we can look at it and acknowledge it. But in doing so, just like if it was our own garden, if it was our own forest, if it was our own land, we could look at it and say, yep, that's there. And we can make alterations to it. We can adjust it. We can cut it back. We can rip it out of the ground. We can plant something new. And that's what we need to do now, is look at this and look at what is working and what isn't. And we have to start deconstructing all of the unconscious beliefs and patterns that we have that says that things can't change, that the way they exist currently is American in some patriotic way. It's not American in a patriotic way. It has nothing to do with the precepts of what America was founded on. These are values that existed in the Netherlands hundreds of years ago that aren't, I'm not saying are right or wrong, and maybe served the Netherlands fairly well, but it doesn't mean that they're natural and native and organic to America. It doesn't mean that they're natural, native, and organic to how America should operate. And it doesn't mean that there's something that can't be removed. In the same way, if we introduce a species here like the invasive carp, it's not a wise thing to do, and if we can remove them, we should. In the same way, any ideas and philosophies that have been introduced into America, no matter how long ago or how old they are, let's be aware of them. Let's be grateful for what we've learned from them. Let's fully and robustly understand them and their influence, but then let's not be controlled by them. Let's not decide that we have to maintain them and uphold them and be in love with them. We don't at all. We can still acknowledge it and decide not to be in love with it, and that there's something else that we can pursue. And this, I think, is a very balanced blend of idealism and pragmaticism. I think it's important that we be pragmatic, but in the way that is the most pragmatic, that is the most efficacious for us. And that is a complete willingness to understand where we're at, how we got here, what has been going on behind the scenes. Really a willingness to have a holistic understanding of everything, and then move forward from there, only after deciding, is everything that I understood complete? And is there anything about what I understood that I have the ability to influence or change? And if so, what is it? And are there any changes or influences that I could make that would be beneficial overall? And if so, implement those. But you see, we're all usually likely willing to implement these things. It's the discovery of them and finding out what it is that we want to implement that is often the harder part. And then once we do find that out, it's about taking the action then to implement them. That is the next hardest part.